Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 10K MA 10,000 Black Appraisers podcast. Today we have Mr. Chase Pursley, whose recent research project on the number of appraisers has taken the appraisal profession by storm, and he's given us an actual count of live, living numbers of appraisers that are actually existing right now. So I'm really, I know I'm excited every week to have our guests come on. Uh, Chase is somebody that I've been following. He's moved to Florida. I told him he was too young to be in Florida. I think the average age of appraisers in Florida is like 85, so he's breaking the curve down there. So welcome, Chase.
Yeah, thank you, Thaddeus, for the warm welcome. It's really fun to be on it. I appreciate the opportunity, especially anytime I get to talk about numbers and data stuff. This is something it might make a lot of other people's eyes glaze over and bore them, but I think appraisers specifically are nerds and we like numbers and we like digging in to that sort of stuff. So I think it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump into your recent work. I know before we started recording, we were talking about a few things, and one being how hard it was for you to get into business when you tried to get into the business, and then you've since created a couple of businesses to help facilitate people getting into the business, which I found to be very attractive and aligns up with our mission. We talked a little bit about the appraisal profession being a very closed and nepotistic sort of profession. I found it to be probably the two least diverse professions in the country are appraising and farming, and we happen to be working with both professions to bring awareness as well as opportunities in the space. And I know you just recently did a big run of all the data and number with the actual number of appraisers, which was far less once you started counting appraisers in multiple states. So, can you tell us a little bit about that work and what your conclusions came up with?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll give a little bit of backstory. So I graduated from Georgia State University with a degree in real estate. That was the focus that I wanted to go, and I wanted to go down the commercial route. And I graduated in summer of 2008. And as everybody who was working back then remembers, that was a really tough time, just in the economy in general, but it was especially a tough time in the real estate space. And so I graduated, and I think sometimes life has a way of kind of bringing you back down to earth. But I kind of, you go to, oh yeah, go to college, do this and that, then you graduate and somebody will, stamp you into a job. Well, it didn't happen like that so easily, especially with the economy the way it was. So it was a bit tough. And I wanted to go to the analytical route, and I thought the appraisal profession was really interesting. And so I took some appraisal classes and kind of I had to go back to my college job, which was commercial landscaping, also some tree farming, or ornamental trees, not food farming. So that kept the bills paid. But I really wanted to go into real estate. And one thing that I noticed is all my classmates, the ones who actually got jobs, they weren't getting the jobs for the job postings. They were the job postings that were out. There wasn't a lot of job postings. They were going to work for their father's company, their relative's company. Speaking of that nepotism, and that was really disheartening. And I don't blame somebody for hiring their children or their relatives into the business. That's gone on for as long as business has been
It
around.
makes
But
it
it's
hard to break into something if you don't have the proper lineage.
Yeah, and so I was like, man, I have this degree. I took all these really wonderful classes. I think I have the base knowledge to do this. So I kept pushing, and I took my real estate licensing classes, and I got lucky, and I sat next to a lady in a USPAP class, which is, you're a licensed appraiser, you know what USPAP is.
Like
It's not
watching
my
paint
favorite.
dry.
Oh man, it's not my favorite class. But I started talking to a lady next to me, and she happened to be a specialty appraiser, had her own company, small company, MAI, and she focused on senior housing and doing commercial landscaping. I had just finished a senior housing job and got to know the developers and thought it was a really interesting space, just because like the demographics with, baby boomers and stuff and where it was going, thought it was going to be a healthy niche. And so I asked her, I said, are you hiring? She said, no. Well, I said, well, I'll show up on Monday anyways. And she basically said there wasn't a lot of work, but she would mentor me. So luckily, she took me in and had a tough a few years because it's getting into those first few years as a trainee. This profession, and it's something I've complained about in the past, is you don't get paid a lot typically those first few years.
No, you don't. And to your answer, I've been doing it a little bit longer than you. I actually moved to Atlanta in 2007. So what we created
Oh,
is an appraisal apprenticeship program. We have the first ever certified through the U.S. Department of Labor in the country of its kind, which we will be launching towards the end of this summer. We'll start our first cohort here in Atlanta. And so to your point, working for free, I mean, the fact that you even got somebody to agree to mentor you for free, I mean, not necessarily for free, but is huge in and of itself. When I first started, I worked for 2 years measuring houses, measuring commercial buildings, doing insurance appraisals. And back then, we didn't have the internet. So I actually had to physically go to the courthouse and go through the courthouse records. So that's kind of a lost art. But a lot of the work that we are doing today, actually in smaller tertiary communities, to actually go get the data for the farmers in the rural communities is still necessary to actually physically go to the courthouse.
yeah. So as a senior housing appraiser, so now there's like larger companies that have branches that focus on just senior housing. But back then, our market was the whole U.S. So sometimes I would go into like a place that was very rural, like in Iowa or wherever, and there were still some places back then, and maybe some of them are the same. If anybody's out there, let me know. You do have to go into the courthouse to get get various public records and stuff. And that was always quite interesting. I actually enjoyed it, but it definitely it's better now where you just type something up and pull it up. So I did that for a couple years and I enjoyed it, but I had always had a soft spot for computers and technology, and I had a little bit of programming experience, built some like marketing websites. Also, had got my real estate license and helped the firm I was working for build a website. And our company was just emailing this job log back and forth, and I thought, well, this isn't very inefficient. It's always out of date and that sort of thing. So I started a company around order manager for appraisers, and that company is called Appraisal Inbox. So that's been what I've been working on. So I switched to that to working on that full time. So I've been focused on that. But at the end of last year, I started up a new effort, something that I've wanted to do for a while that it's always kind of been on the back burner, never really had time for it. But that's a job portal, a job site for jobs that are just in the appraisal and valuation industry, because there just wasn't much like that out there. If you were interested in like an internship or a trainee looking for an opening, or maybe somebody moving to a new market and you wanted to go work for as an appraiser for somebody else, you go to Google search, hopefully something is in Indeed or one of those other big job portals, but there was nothing really focused on the appraisal and valuation space. And so I put together jobsandappraisal.com to focus on that. So it's kind of two things. It's a job portal where we list job openings that are in the valuation and appraisal space. There's also a newsletter, so we send a newsletter out once a week that have the latest job openings. So that's gone pretty well. I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with that. I actually had a lot more. I thought I would be talking to more employers, but I've actually had a lot of people who are interested in getting into the appraisal industry and looking for jobs themselves, like reach out to me, and I didn't expect that, and so I've had a lot of really interesting conversations there. So that's what I've been focused on lately, and one of the things I wanted to do was kind of find out. I was doing a little research, and you see this question a lot. People talk about or insist that they know exactly how many appraisers are there in the U.S. And you hear things like, well, there's an appraiser shortage, and some people are pushing that angle. Well, and so I realized, well, this is public data. It's all we're all licensed. So I started looking into where you can find that public data. We have the appraisal subcommittee. They have a website where you can download a list of all the active licenses in the U.S. So I
Once you
thought,
started
okay,
to do that, I'm curious as to what the accuracy was from the public records as opposed to your research, as opposed to the ASC website.
Yeah, that's where it got really funny. I thought it would just be a simple download and then just get a count of how many licenses there were, and then figure out the you have people who have licenses in multiple states, and then figure that out. And it turned out the data was actually really, um, I get in data science, I guess I call it dirt. I'm not a data science guy. I pretend to be one at times when I need to, but they call it like dirty data. And so it turns out when I started looking into it, the appraisal subcommittee would get the list of licensed appraisers from each state. And each state does things a little bit differently. They have different standards,
Or
different
Phil
data
Crawford
standards.
referred to it as data cancer.
There you go. That's a good one. I like that. So it just depends on how well the individual state has their act together. And I actually had a few people reach out to me from different federal organizations, appraisal subcommittee, with tips and some backstory and stuff. So it turns out that all this data is coming from the different states, and there's an issue where you have somebody with the same name, but maybe they got registered. Maybe like you moved from Cincinnati to Ohio, right? That's
Yeah, from
yeah,
Cincinnati to Atlanta.
to Atlanta. So you probably have a license in both states, or you did at one point. I don't know if you
Yeah, I
maintain
still
it.
carry both of them.
So you have people like that who moved, and you'll have I don't know, maybe you have a different first name or different middle name, and so you'll have people who are registered slightly different, and so their names might be a little bit different. Then you have a situation where you have people with the same name. Like for example, I'm no longer licensed. But at one point, there was, and it's a name I would never think there would be another person in the appraisal industry with it, but there was another Chase Pursley out there at one point who was a commercial appraiser out in Texas. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not the unique unicorn that my mom told me that I was. But so in that case, if somebody were to go look up, okay, how many licenses does Chase Pursley have? They would see that I had two licenses, and that would be incorrect data. And so I realized pretty quickly that this is crazy because usually with data, you want to have what's called a unique ID, unique identifying number, like a social security number is supposed to be unique. I guess we're finding out that maybe there's some issues there too. So it's a complicated thing. And so some people
What
reached
about
out
if
to me and
people
said,
get married and change and hyphenate their names or change their names?
yeah, that's a good point. So, names change, some people legally change their names. And so the way you deal with that is a unique identifier that's not based on your name. And internally, from what I understand, they were using the social security number, but you can't put that out publicly. So they actually they reached out, somebody reached out to me, a couple people, and said they had an effort and they actually had funding for it to unify and find a unique identifying, basically come up with a system that wasn't insane. And they started working on it, and the way that it was funded, and I might be getting some of the details wrong, but they reached out to a third party service that does data stuff with governments. I might be getting details wrong, but basically the government came back and said you can't do it like this, like misappropriation of funds, because all the everything wasn't checked off correctly, or whatever. It was just bureaucracy basically, and so it never happened. They never got the unique number system in place. So here
Do
we
you
are with
think
this
one of
messy.
the cures to that possibly is going to a national license?
I don't know. What do you think that would mean, a national license where you get licensed, you can appraise in
I
any
just
state?
think there's no uniformity from state to state, and the requirements sort of fluctuate. And you have people with I multiple licenses in multiple states, and I think if you go to a national license, you can standardize the requirements, and everybody can be following the same set of rules and guidelines. As it is pretty parsed up, and I think you bring some public trust and public control back mechanisms because through the ASB and I mean the AQB and the ASC and all the alphabet soup, the industry is totally and completely lost. And this 34-year experiment that we've had with the Appraisal Foundation has been a complete abject disaster. So there's nobody responsible. There's not a responsible party. There's not an accountable party. And there is no transparency in it whatsoever. So I think it would go along to modernizing the whole process and being able to keep up with the numbers. And there's a shortage of appraisers. And I think if you can get some uniformity in the requirements, that goes towards modernizing the process. Just my humble opinion.
Yeah, I actually haven't thought about a national level licensing. I think the lenders might like that because they're not typically, unless it's like a credit union or something, they're typically lending across state lines into multiple states. So that might be something they would be open to, or at least something they would like from their perspective.
It would definitely help from a review standpoint, and by there being such a shortage and desperate need, basically you pretty much have it anyway. It's just the appraisers are bound by USPAP. Nobody else is bound by USPAP. So what you tend to have is folks that are operating in multiple states who are not subject matter experts, but responsible for pontificating about subject matter that they don't really have a clue of. And so it leaves the appraisers sort of hamstring strung with tied with one hand behind their back, having to follow the USPAP guidelines when there's all these AI and different tools available that everybody else is using. Why not allow the appraiser to be able to use them, especially since they're working on modernizing the process anyway and eliminating appraisers? So there's going to be fewer of them. So you might as well be able to cover more area. Henceforth, back to the training and education and the qualifications. They're constantly trying to water down the educational requirements, and education is being provided, in my opinion, is not adequate and substantive. And the people who were responsible for that have closed everybody off and making it so insular to now there's a workforce development shortage. So between modernizing the process, implementing a national license, and again, it's back to public trust as well as protecting the public's money because
Mhm.
every time there's a crash, who pays for it? The
And
public.
who gets blamed?
Yeah,
The appraiser
and
gets blamed.
then appraisers get blamed and carry the burden, and we as appraisers suffer from um, PTSD, quite frankly. So I think this would go a long way to being able to help educate the appraisers by modernizing the process, which they're actually doing now by switching over to form, which will be actually in 2026, but the current form is dated 2005. So it's 21 years old. And I always ask people, how many phones and updates have you had since 2005 on your phone? And we're just
Gosh, when did the
now,
iPhone come out? The iPhone came out like it was maybe 2007-ish.
yeah, they're on, but they're on the 16th iPhone right now. So the iPhone
Yeah.
has been updated 16 times, where the appraisal URAR form has been updated. It hasn't. So,
And
and
I've
it,
seen arguments about the form. I come from a commercial background, so I'm not as familiar with it. But I don't think of an appraisal report as a form or a specific format. I think of it as an analysis. And some people think about it just filling out a form. It's not what,
So
it's
you think
not the
about
mindset they
it
come
the
from.
right way because you were trained the right way. But the form is supposed to be a condensed version of the analysis.
Right.
So most people learn from the form as opposed to the way you learn. The form was supposed to be able to expedite it, and what it did was eliminate it brought uniformity, which was necessary to be able to mitigate the risk on the secondary market. But then what it did was dumb down the actual profession so people didn't have to utilize critical thinking skills, and all the education went to check the box. So now if you have to get outside the box, nobody can think, and everything has been melted and watered down. And if you're looking
Mhm.
at the underwriting, again, you don't have subject matter experts in the space. So when I'm looking at and doing these analyses about appraisal bias and discrimination, I would say 90% of it is bad appraisers that haven't been very well trained. And you take that with some institutional redlining and other things that have gone into the appraisal process. And then again, the appraisers are hamstrung on what they can and cannot do. So I believe that moving to the new form, like you said, and doing more writing and analysis is definitely the answer. But with that, it needs to be a standardized process, and you might as well do it nationally because at the end of the day, the GSEs, you want to be able to mitigate the risk, and it should be the same for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight because it's the same form nationally, license wise, and it could take a burden off the states. So that's something that's really interesting. So that would definitely save, or that would definitely solve the issue of knowing how many appraisals. That's just crazy to me that we don't have a system where we just know like that exactly down to the exact count how many licensed appraisers there are in the U.S. And even with my analysis, I can't, I'm maybe. I feel pretty confident the numbers are pretty good because I've refined it a few times and I'm still probably off by like five, maybe five plus, maybe five Mayas. Um,
And I know talking to
and
you, I was trying to get up to speed about how many appraisers were here in Georgia, and I think there's like 800 commercial appraisers and probably 1,400 residential appraisers, if I'm remembering correctly. And I would say over probably half of those appraisers, only half of those appraisers actually are live or registered here in Georgia. So I think
right.
some of those are multiple licenses, and I don't really know what the real number is. And when you start to look at the work and the level of impact, it just needs to what you did was I found to be very timely. And then if you go even further and look at what we're talking about, trying to increase the numbers and open up the opportunities, if you don't even know how many you have, then you're very challenged at how many women, how many blacks, how many ethnic groups are being broken out. And the other thing that I always look and see, and nobody ever keeps record of, and they act like I'm crazy when you start looking at the disciplinary actions. If you look at or you go ask Arrow, nobody keeps that information. And I believe the disciplinary actions are disproportionate to people of color as well because their disciplinary actions are usually criminalized or they're forced out of the business, which has a very negative impact on the number and accessibility. It's one thing becoming an appraiser, it's a whole nother thing staying an appraiser. And then after that, trying to make a living just being an appraiser is extremely difficult to navigate due to the lack of
Yeah, you have to keep your
accountability and
license.
transparency.
You have to keep your license. You have to do your continue education training. That's not cheap. When I graduated college, I had all this student debt and stuff. And then all of a sudden you have these very expensive, classes right from the get-go, and then you have that your whole career. And I mean that's a good thing that they do the continuing education because it keeps you sharp and up to speed and stuff, and gives you something, that USPAP classes and stuff. Not the most exciting. Um, but and then you have these years where there's, the last few years have been really tough for appraisers. A lot of appraisers didn't make a whole lot of money. And with the numbers, one thing you just mentioned just made me think out of those appraisers, like you said, some weren't registered in Georgia, but they had like a Georgia license. Maybe it's somebody like in Tennessee doing cross border stuff a little bit back and forth. But then you think, how many of those appraisers are actually working full time or maybe kind of semi-retired? Or like some appraisers will be a real estate agent at the same time or like some other stuff. So how many actual appraisers do we have doing full-time appraisal work? I don't know how to get at that number.
Well, one of the things that you talked about, it's been a tough time for appraisers. What it hasn't been is a tough time for appraisal management companies. So
Yeah.
they,
Oh, it's the worst.
they've been siphoning off all the money, and the appraisers are struggling, and it's been disproportionate. And I believe that's another reason to go to a national license. I believe you can eliminate some of the fat with the appraisal management companies and the appraisers can be paid directly. And the way that everything is being automated now, it's just there's going to be fewer number of appraisers anyway with appraisal waivers and all the other alternative valuation models that are out there. So with the modernization with Fannie and Freddie, the use of data collectors as opposed to appraisers going out and doing inspections, um, there's really no way to unspill the milk. And the best thing to do is be able to be trained and be prepared for the future. And like you talked about the analysis, if you're able to analyze the information and report it effectively, I believe there's a place for you to make a decent living in this profession.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a really great profession. I mean, how many other industries are there where you can work for yourself? It's not some outside job where you're, digging a hole in the ground. I did commercial landscaping. That's hard work. Physically hard work that beats you up, and it's not something you want to be doing when you're 55. With the appraisal profession, it gives you a lot of variety. You get to go do your site inspections. You get to get outside the house. You get to talk to people some. I know a lot of appraisers are kind of introverts, maybe don't like that part as much, but that part can be interesting. Then you get to come back to your office, sit down, really just dig in and focus for a while. It's great if you're a stay-at-home parent, like maybe I think it's a great profession for women, if they want to be like a kind of a part stay-at-home mom and kind of balance the kid and stuff, or even a dad. I think.
You're not dragging me into that one, Trace. I think it's a great profession for everybody. So,
Yeah, it really is. And I think a lot I listened to some of your other episodes, and I know you're pretty focused on trying to help, more black people get into the appraisal business. And I think a lot of it's just making and I talked to some people at the Appraisal Institute and a couple others, and just in general, the appraisal industry doesn't sound sexy to a lot of people on paper. And I think a lot of it is communicating that, well, maybe it's not sexy at all, but it's interesting and it's interesting work, and it can pay pretty decently if you're at it for long enough and persistent. But it offers you a lot of flexibility. You get to do, data analysis. You get to work from home if you work for yourself, or you can go to jobs in appraisal and go work for somebody and go to an office if that's your thing and you want to get that steady paycheck. Um, but there's a lot of flexibility, a lot of options in the appraisal industry, and I just
but you've
don't think a
covered
lot
a
of people
lot
know
of them
about
in
it.
with your background. So even like most people don't get to see the depth and breadth of the things that I've been able to look at. So even with your forestry background, that's a field in and of itself. Being able to appraise timbers, uh, conservation easements. Those are all types of opportunities, but you can't check the box. So we put 21 kids in internships this year with the Forest Service last summer. So
Oh, cool.
and the whole goal was to create opportunities that are different, with the right of way and the infrastructure, easements. There's so many opportunities, but you need to establish a basis and utilize critical thinking skills outside of being able to check the box. And what you talked about senior housing, back when you started, there wasn't a lot of data. There's boatloads of data out there now, and facilities and information, especially with the aging population. It's very viable and a very good investment class in and of itself.
Yeah, you make a good point about the variety too. You mentioned the timber stuff. So I was doing like ornamental farming, like maple trees and stuff for landscaping jobs. But I have a good friend who does timber, like it's like timber. What does he do? He's an appraiser who focuses on easements for like different things like utility lines and stuff. And timber is a big aspect of what he does. And so his appraisal career was totally different from mine. I was going into these senior housing facilities where you have, the Alzheimer's ward, and, a very different kind of environment than what he does. And he has to drive out to these rural properties and get on his, 4x4, or the quad things, four-wheelers and stuff, and go really way out into the middle of nowhere. And dodge rattlesnakes and stuff. And for him, it's great. For me, I don't know if that would be for me.
But a lot
But
of
then you
what
have,
what we're doing now in those spaces, and we're also incorporating drone training. So
oh yeah, yeah,
drones is a
didn't think about
career
that.
in and of itself, and a new way to be able to inspect and do those types of properties. It's an incredible opportunity, and it's really vast at what is out there and available. As a matter of fact, we talk about the undervaluation for Black and Indigenous people, but the undervaluation for the federal government and in the Native Americans probably is around $1 trillion, because they have outdated fee schedules going across federal lands. So they haven't been updated in 30 years. So if you can appraise those and bring those up to speed just with the current rental rates, I believe you can reduce the national debt by 10%.
Interesting. I haven't thought about that perspective. You're talking about like native lands and
Oh, actually,
territories and stuff?
absolutely. If you Google the BNSF and the Swinomish tribe, they were supposedly had an agreement since the 90s to haul oil and freighters going across their land, and one of them wrecked. And so they had a $400 million settlement last year in July. That's one. That's just one fee schedule and one across Washington State. Imagine all the fee
Hmm.
schedules going across all the states if they were able to be updated. You talked about the transmission lines that go um, across federal lands and Native American lands. Those fees haven't been updated forever. So if you could just get the valuations on those and bring them current, there's a significant amount of money and funding available there, all in the appraisal
It sounds
space.
like maybe they potentially could be getting shafted there. That's and see that's another
Potentially, no,
thing.
not potentially. That's what's happening.
Man, so that's another thing that an appraiser can do. They can help represent you, and help be, they're supposed to be, independent opinion of value. But that's another cool thing about the profession. We can help establish this neutral opinion of value. So that's another thing I think it's great about it. So it was really interesting digging into the data. I had a lot of private questions come to me, and some of them were like I had a lady ask me if there were any details about the female to male ratio, and there aren't. And I also had a lot of questions about age, and they don't track things like age. And even when I was back when I first started, it was on up there in terms of how the cohort, at least it felt like it. I didn't know the actual numbers, but I heard numbers, fly around about, the age, and it was basically like 55 plus white men, pretty much, at least a higher percentage than the general population. Um, and so one thing, like in terms of equality and equity and whatnot, you think you would at least want to see kind of compared to the general population, that same percentage in the appraisal profession.
It's not even
But I doubt,
close. It's not even the
and I
same
think
ballpark.
I heard you say there was only like 2,000 more or less black appraisers. Is that
Yeah,
the number
yeah,
that I heard? Okay.
yeah. And if you count those in multiple states, you're probably half of that. And then if you look at 90% of that 2000 would be residential. So if you find a black commercial appraiser, you pretty much got a unicorn on your hand. And
Yeah, so I moved to have a house on the south side of Atlanta, but my I had that house appraised I think twice, and the appraiser came, and of course I was an appraiser, so I kind of hovered behind him, probably drove him crazy. But he was a black guy, and I didn't even think at the time there's anything special. Then I realized later I was like, wow, that guy was a unicorn. Holy crap. Um, but so if you look at the percentages of different groups in the U.S. By ethnicity, and then you take that percentage and multiply it by the number of appraisers. So the kind of the ballpark number I came to is that there were about 67,000 appraisers. So if you take the percentage of this, this or that group and multiply it by that, then you would hope there would at least be around that number in the appraisal field, and not just the appraisal field, but other fields. But since we're in the appraisal field, so
but
that's
if you're
something else.
looking for
I have a
black
lot of questions about
appraisers,
that.
especially commercial, you probably Atlanta, Texas, California, and the DMV. Outside of that,
Interesting.
you're going to be looking for a raisin and a bowl of milk.
Wow. So in terms of age, I didn't have a really good way to get at it. I had questions about the, like racial makeup and it's a really touchy subject that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but I also had questions about the female. So I kind of had an idea at how to maybe get at that number. I didn't do it. A, because it's such a touchy subject, and B, it probably would have cost a lot of money. But there is a way using AI to classify things. So you can say, is this in theory, you could say, is this name, this first name of a particular racial group typically, and you're not going to get a, you might be able to get kind of a ballpark figure from that. You're not going to get a totally accurate name because you have people with names that span all over the place. But it did cross my mind that I could technically have run that research that I did through a classifier to say, is this person, more likely to be Korean, more likely to be, and tag them as, a person of likely of that descent based on a name. And the same thing with sex. With gender, you could say, well, this person's Sarah, they're, pretty likely to be a female. And from that, you could probably get a ballpark number. So if somebody wants to run those numbers, I open source all the data on how to break down the appraisal subcommittee data. And if you want to run that, go for it. But it would have to make like 70,000 OpenAI API calls, and that probably would have been a couple $100. Um, but yeah, I had a lot of interest. I had a lot of interesting private questions on that, and also had somebody send me a chart of the. So one thing the appraisal subcommittee does, you can only get the current data. Uh, what I would like to see is all the historical data to see the trends, like how many licensed appraisers are there? Is it going down? Is it going up? And some lady had been tracking it for a couple of years, on her own, and she actually showed like a correlation between states, about the decline or increase of appraisers, and then correlated that to that state's, whether a red state or a blue state. And I won't go into details about how that looked, so there's all these interesting things you can do with data and numbers and compare it to other data sets. So
I think
it's a
that
lot more interesting than.
bolsters my argument for a national license even more so than ever because it impacts the economy and the global supply chain significantly, and there's no way to track it. And what has been happening has not been very good, and there hasn't been any accountability and uniformity. And first and foremost, they're trying to increase the numbers. I do not think watering down the educational requirement is the way to do that. I do believe that you can do both. Now you're kind of pushing and pulling at the same time but with the technology that is available, you can you don't need as many appraisers, but you need to maximize the use of the technology and the data science. And so the folks that are coming in now need to be trained accordingly. And so I see a lot of pushback from the appraisers about data collectors. I think that's the wrong argument. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to measure and take pictures of a house.
I have mixed feelings about that. I did a lot of site inspections, when I was a trainee. Back then I forget what the rules were, but I think it was a state by state basis, and I think there was a little bit of gray zone if I should have been doing that, at the time. But I mean, I was taking pictures and measuring, basically, looking at facilities and that sort of thing, while the MAI and the experience appraisal staff was, working on the back end of the report.
But the automation
So
and technology, you can do everything from your phone. It'll take all the
yeah,
spatial and measurements and if you train the whoever's doing that up to do it with ANSI standards,
that's the key, I think, is
yeah,
is
the
making sure
key
that
is
property data
training.
collector is
If
trained.
if you can train and optimize whoever is responsible for that portion and the appraisers, I mean, appraising during COVID was probably the best appraising ever. You didn't have to go in the house. I don't think it really impacted anything because people were able to turn in the pictures that they wanted you to utilize. And basically, everything is, if it's been done in the last 10 years, is in some public record form or fashion, some kind of way, even in the UAD data set. So that's what it's all about. So it's just modernizing and utilizing the tools that are available now.
So with those personal data collectors, maybe if they're trained, they have some kind of license or some kind of certification, in some kind of way to check in on the quality, standards basically. Maybe that's a path, at least on the residential side. What do you think? So I have some opinions on the appraisal education requirements and that sort of stuff. How do you feel about the college requirement on the commercial side?
I believe the college requirement is you can keep the college requirement, but there's alternative things that you can do experience wise, and henceforth our appraisal apprenticeship program. And beyond sounding self-serving, that is what I do believe because ultimately, even when you have a college degree, it's a matter of understanding the principles of the profession, but you need the repetition, and that's the only way that you're able to get better is the repetition. And I try to encourage folks, I don't care if you make a mistake. This is when you're supposed to make a mistake. You just can't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So that is where you get better because you're able to get the repetition. And if you can get a livable wage while you're performing, just like anything, any other profession, plumbing, electric, you've taken the coursework, but you need those hours of actually perfecting your trade. So actually, to perfect anything, it takes 10,000 hours. So, but
Yeah.
you got to start somewhere. And so I believe that if we start, then you're able to get better. And a lot of times when you start, it's not where you end up anyway, because we've had a number of folks. And so in our outside the barn series careers this weekend, I had a student who was she was a wonderful commercial appraiser. She just hated appraising. Now she underwrites hotel stacks. So you can use that skill set to be an analyst, which where I believe is everything is headed for realtors and for appraisers. Everybody needs to be able to do a little bit of both. And because of technology, everybody needs to be able to grow and move more towards the center. So the educational requirement at the lower levels, the college degree I don't believe is necessary, but you can utilize. But when you start doing institutional stuff, uh, large commercial stuff, even the discounted cash flow analysis, you got programs to be able to do all that stuff now. So
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and college isn't for everybody. People learn differently and process differently.
Yeah, and it's expensive too, so I have the degree in real estate and everything, and I went through a lot of kind of the classes that really set you up for that. And the college requirement is so broad, you could study and I'm not picking on my wife, she's brilliant, but she was a French major. And I kind of wonder how I mean, you kind of wonder how useful that would be if she were to go into the appraisal profession, because she would have to start from scratch essentially and learn a lot of that stuff I learned. So it's if they my opinion is if they're going to have the college requirement, it should be only a few, maybe like accounting and some of those kinds of things. Otherwise, I'm of the strong opinion that a really self-motivated person who's willing to put in those apprenticeship hours could figure it out,
I
over
think it's
time
the
with a good
apprenticeship
mentor.
hours along with the core courses, and
Yeah.
that if you get that, and you can possibly use multiple disciplines, but I don't really think we need to be watering down the profession in order to increase the numbers. So you can have the degree requirement, but then you also need alternatives to go along or to supplement the degree requirements because the degree requirements, the degree doesn't have to be in anything specific. So that just demonstrates that you have the ability to get the degree.
That's a fair point. Yeah. So with your mentorship program, is that a nationwide effort?
It's
How does somebody
apprenticeship
talk to you about
program.
that and look?
Apprenticeship. So it's certified
Apprenticeship.
nationally, and so we are doing it state by state, and to order to get it up and running, to have more of a proof of concept. So it's as you know, starting something new from scratch that's never been done is quite the massive undertaking, especially when you don't have a lot of support and you just have a vision and you move forward. It's counter to what's been done, what's always been done, and everybody's saying and doing and regurgitating the same thing. And when you're blazing a new trail, it's just that it comes with bumps and bruises. take off my shirt, I'd show them all to you, but I'm sure you're not interested in seeing that. But we're both here, we're both still standing, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I reach out to you online all the time, and just excited to be able to collaborate and cheer for you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the work you're doing, and it's always fun to talk about data stuff and the industry and how to, how to help people understand how to get into the industry. And you know, like I mentioned, it's not maybe on paper the sexiest industry, but I think it's a lot cooler than maybe it gets credit for. So I think I think it's cool stuff. And if you're listening to this and you're not an appraiser and you're thinking about it, I guess reach out to either of us. But I definitely think it's a path. I don't think the appraisal profession is going away. I think maybe some stuff, like you said, is going to get automated, and maybe that's to some people sounds like a bad word, but some people hear that say, "Oh, that's going to help me in my job." Do a better job. So I think the industry is going to stay here, and I think it's all about education. So yeah.
I mean, look at what you've done. I mean, you've taken what you learned in appraising and you've pivoted and turned it into something special. And so again, it's about thinking and being creative in the thinking and in how it impacts the global supply chain. There's no place that you can go in the country that doesn't have a tax assessor's office that needs some level of appraising. Uh, you might not be able to find insurance anywhere, but to be able to establish a basis for cost approach, again, those are based on appraisals. Where you're looking at for power lines, appraisals, right of way, appraisals. I mean,
Mhm.
all these things, but they require critical thinking skills, not a check the box. And, sometimes you just have to be able to think and not only think, but be able to write and express yourself. But there's so many tools available now to modernize the process to make it available to everybody. So you got anything else, Chase? Or I didn't want to end like that, but
I could probably keep you for a long time talking about all sorts of subjects, but I think we covered a lot. Like I said, I appreciate you having me on. If anybody has any insights into the main topic with the ASC data, I've had like I mentioned, people reach out to me privately and said, "Oh, I found this thing," or here's some other data and some other things that
oh, and what's your
I
website so if folks want to come look at
oh.
your appraisals.com?
Yeah, so the this project that I'm working on that I started last year is called jobsinappraisal.com, and it's just a job board and a newsletter for jobs in the appraisal and valuation industry. So if you're looking for a job or an internship or like a trainee position, something like that, take a look at that. Sign up for the newsletter, and we send an email out with those latest openings. And I'm also working on a new site. This one is another one I've wanted to work on for a while, and that's findinappraiser.com. And I'm just starting that one up. And the idea with that is kind of related to what you're talking about earlier, is to give, a lot of appraisers don't have very strong web presence. And if I was somebody who needed to if I was a lawyer or whatever, and I needed to find a divorce appraiser or any kind of private non-lending purpose, where do you go? And a lot of appraisers don't have a web presence, and some have great web presences. So find an appraiser, the idea with that is to have, like a little profile of the appraiser, some information about them, and give the end consumer looking for private appraisers the opportunity to connect with them. And so that's still a work in progress.
That's kind
So
of
that
something that
one's fun to
we've
present.
been working on as well.
Oh,
So
great.
our new website is under construction. Should be up next week. 10,000blackappraisers.com. So we have been. I'm on my fifth website in the less than 2 years. So it's but with each iteration we keep getting better and stronger and adding more bells and whistles and connectivity. So hopefully we'll be able to do some linkages between our two sites to be able to increase the number of appraisers and help people be able to find appraisers out here in this space.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Well, thanks again, Chase. I really appreciate you and the work you're doing. And thank you for taking our time and getting on, jumping on the podcast here with us. And I look forward to continuing to follow you and staying in touch and keep up the good work.